Freddy the Pig, To and Again by Walter R. Brooks. Chapter 1. Charles the rooster came out of the front door of the chicken coop and walked slowly across the barnyard. It was still very dark in the barnyard, for it was 4:30 in the morning, and the sun was not yet up. He shivered and thought of his nice warm porch in the coop, but there was a reason why he did not go back to it. Mr. Bean, the farmer, did not have very much money, and could not afford to buy an alarm clock, and he had relied on the rooster to wake him up bright and early in the morning. The last time Charles had overslept, Mr. Bean had been very angry and had threatened to have him fricasseed with baking powder biscuits for Sunday dinner. Charles did not like getting up early, before any of the other birds and animals were stirring, but he felt that it was the better to get up than to be fricasseed, and so this morning he hopped sleepily on to the post, and after clearing his throat several times, began to crow, "Cock-a-doodle-doo, cock-a-doodle-doo." The eastern sky grew brighter and brighter, and pinker and pinker. For a long time nothing else happened. Then some robins began talking together in little quiet voices in the big elm tree that grew by the barn, and a young chipmunk came scampering along the fence and stopped on the post next to Charles and started to wash his face with his paws. And down in the house where the pig lived, there was a great grunting and squealing, so that Charles knew that the pigs were beginning to think about breakfast, and he crowed some more. And at last, far off across the field, where the sky came down to meet them, there appeared a little spark of bright gold that grew and grew until it looked like a bonfire, and then like a house on fire, and then like a whole city burning up. And that was the upper edge of the sun coming up from the other side of the world, where all night long it had been shining on Chinese pagodas and the Himalayas and jungles in Africa, and all the odd places where people work and play while we are sound asleep. And just as the edge of the sun came into sight, the head of Mr. Bean, the farmer, appeared at his window. He had on a white cotton nightcap with a red tassel, and his face was completely hidden behind his bushy gray whiskers, so that nobody, not even his wife, had ever seen what he really looked like. And he was looking out to see what kind of a day it was going to be. As soon as Mr. Bean poked his head out of the window, Charles hopped down from the post. His day's work was already done, but although he was still cold and sleepy, he did not go back to the hen house, for his wife and her 8 sisters were up by this time, and nobody could get a minute's peace in all that racket. He muttered angrily, "I'll go take 40 winks in the barn." "Good morning, Charles," said Hank, the old white horse, whose stall was nearest the door. "Touch of winter in the air this morning." Charles flew up and perched on the edge of Hank's manger. "Touch of winter!" he exclaimed. "I guess there is. It's cold, that's what it is, downright cold." "Well, we've got to expect it now," said Hank. "Snow will be flying in another month or 2. "Ugh," said Charles, and shivered. "There's less work for me in the winter," said Hank, "though I must say I prefer the summer. I've got a touch of rheumatism in my hind leg, and these cold winters set it aching." "Of course," said Charles sympathetically. "They would. It's a shame. You ought to have a blanket or something to cover you, and this barn is a terribly drafty old place. But Mr. Bean, he never thinks how the animals and birds suffer. He sleeps warm under his feather bed and 4 patchwork quilts. He doesn't care as long as he's warm. Now take me. Every morning, winter and summer, I have to get up before daylight and crawl out of my comfortable coop and crow and get things started on the farm, just because he's too stingy to buy himself an alarm clock. Doesn't matter how cold and rainy it is, it has to be done. And if I miss a morning, what do I get? I get fricasseed, that's what." "It seems sort of hard," said Hank. "I guess it does. And now winter's coming. I detest winter, but I've got to get out just the same and wade around in the snow and freeze my bill. I wouldn't mind so much if I was warm and the rest of the time. If there was a stove in the hen house and a couple of good wool blankets to sleep under. That hen house ought to have a cellar under it, too. The floor's as cold as a stone. Hank sighed. Yes, he agreed. It's a hard life. There's no denying it. But what can we do about it? A little tittering voice answered from high up under the roof. Why don't you migrate? It said. They looked up, but it was dark in the roof, and they could not see anything. Who are you? Asked Charles. And what are you talking about? I'm a barn swallow, said the voice, and I'm talking about migrating. We birds all migrate every year, and I don't see why you don't do it too, if you don't like the winter. Oh, you don't, said Charles rather crossly. Well, suppose you tell me what you're talking about, if it's worth listening to. We can't keep track of everything you little unimportant birds do. Charles, being a farm bird, felt very superior to all the wild birds, and he puffed out his chest with importance. But the swallow only laughed, chirping. You don't need to be so grand, she said. After all, you've never been outside your own barnyard, and you have to do as you're told, or you get fricasseed. And I've traveled thousands of miles in my time, and I don't take orders from anyone. Well, of all the... Charles began angrily, but Hank shook his head at him. She may have something interesting to tell us, he said, and then he asked the swallow politely if she would explain to them what migrating was. So she told them that every fall, when it began to get cold and the birds gathered together in big flocks and started south, they traveled hundreds of miles, and some of them went to Florida and some went to Central or South America. All winter long, she said, it was sunny and warm down south. There was never any snow, never any cold winds, and there was always plenty to eat, and then in the spring they could come back north again. When she had told them this, she dropped with a twitter from the roof and shot like an arrow out from the open door into the warm sunshine. Do you believe it? Charles asked, when she had gone. He felt it beneath his dignity to pay attention to anything a swallow could tell him, although he was really very interested. Yes, said Hank, I have heard of it before, and it sounds pretty good, but it wouldn't do for me, I'm afraid. It's a long road to Florida. If I could fly, though, I won't say that I wouldn't try it. I can't fly, said Charles, not much, that is, but I would walk a good many miles to find a place where it is warm and sunny all winter, and where I shouldn't have to get up in the morning till I got good and ready. It wouldn't be any fun going alone, of course, but if we could get up a party... If you could get up a party, said Hank, I won't say I shouldn't like to go myself. Charles jumped down from the manger. I'm going to see some of the other animals, he said. If they're interested, we'll have a meeting tonight and talk it over. And he went out into the yard. The more he thought about it, the more excited he became. He went out into the orchard and talked to an oriole and a couple of blackbirds, and the tales they told him of the lazy life they led in the tropical southern sunshine fairly made his mouth water. Then he went to see the pigs and the cows and the other animals, and they were very much interested, and said that they all had been dreading the long cold winter, and that if he really knew of a place where it was warm and sunshiny, they would be very glad to go there. So he invited them to come to a meeting that evening in the cow barn, where he would tell them all about it, and those who wanted to go could talk it over and decide when to start. Chapter 2. Now all this time Charles had not said anything to his wife and her 8 sisters about what the birds had told him, and he had not invited them to the meeting. "She always disapproves of everything I do," he grumbled, "and her sisters always agree with her. It will be much better meeting if she doesn't come. I can tell her about it afterwards." His wife's name was Henrietta, and she was a very busy hen, for she had 10 little chickens to take care of, and so she was sometimes rather cross to Charles, who never did much work and used to get in her way a good deal. That night when Charles started out, she called back to him and asked him where he was going. "I have to attend a business meeting," he said importantly. "I'm expected to make a speech." "Much good your speech will do anybody," said Henrietta. But she was busy putting the chickens to bed, and Charles slipped out before she had time to say any more. The meeting was a great success. Nearly all the animals on the farm came, and the cow barn was crowded to the doors. Charles spoke long and eloquently and drew glowing pictures of what their life would be like in the southern land, lolling under the orange trees and telling stories and cracking jokes all day long. The pigs, who had come in a body and sat in the front row, applauded heartily, and the cows mooed and the ducks quacked, and the dogs barked, and even the mice, who sat in a row on one of the rafters, squeaked excitedly. "Now, my friends," said Charles, when he had told them all he had learned from the birds, "I have placed before you these facts. It remains for us to act upon them. I, for one, intend to follow the example of the birds and go south for the winter. It is true that it is easier for the birds than it is for us. The birds can fly across the rivers that we shall have to swim or wade, and across mountains that we shall have to climb. I do not conceal from you that it may be a hard journey, but it is my experience that nothing that is worth getting is easy to get. However, I shall be glad to hear what anyone else has to say, and I accordingly throw the meeting open to discussion." And amid prolonged cheers, he hopped down from the seat of the old buggy from which he had addressed the meeting. Then for quite a while the animals were much excited and all talked at once. All of them hated the thought of the long, cold winter, and when somebody, I think it was Freddy, the smallest and cleverest of the pigs, shouted, "Why don't we start tonight?" they all gave 3 cheers and started towards the door. But just then Jock, the larger of the 2 dogs, a wise old Scottish collie, got up. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you have all heard what my friend the rooster has said, and I think we all agree with him that it would be a fine thing if we could all go south this winter." "Yes, yes," cried all the animals together. "But there's one thing that I think we've forgotten. I'm not a fine speaker like Charles, but I just want to say that we must not forget our duty. We cannot all leave Mr. Bean, for he could not get along without us." Here Charles interrupted excitedly. "Mr. Bean!" he shouted. "What do we care for Mr. Bean? What has he ever done for us? He can sleep warm these winter nights. He can have feather beds and stoves. But we don't have such things. We don't matter. Why doesn't he warm our houses for us? Why—" "Yes, yes, Charles," said Jock quietly, "but listen to me a minute. Mr. Bean feeds us and gives us a place to live and looks after us when we're sick. We can't just desert him, can we?" "Well, perhaps you're right," said Charles unwillingly. "Of course I am," said Jock. And he went on to say that while those of them whom Mr. Bean did not need during the winter could go south if they wanted to, he thought the others should stay. "I can't go," he said, "and if one of the horses should stay to take Mr. Bean into town when he wants to go, and one of the cows and some of the hens ought to stay too, so he will have eggs and milk. This is all I have to say." And he bowed and sat down. A long discussion followed, but as all the animals wanted to go, none of them except Jock would admit that they were needed on the farm. They talked louder and louder and grew more and more angry at each other, and it seemed like that the meeting would break up in disorder, when there was a loud, ear-piercing meow, and Jinx the cat bounded through the doorway. In the silence that followed, all the mice upon the rafters gave a horrified squeak, and then they rose as one mouse and tiptoed softly into the convenient hole. "Hello, folks," said Jinx breezily. "What's all the row? I could hear you way down by the mill pond, where I was hunting a frog. Better make less noise, or you'll have old Bean out here with a shotgun. What's the matter, anyway?" "Fine," he said, when they had told him. "Fine. That's a great idea. Charlie, old boy, don't think you had it in you. But, see here, no use quarreling about who's to go and who's not. Draw lots, and that's the way to do it. Now, you say only one cow can go. Well, here's 3 of them. Mrs. Wiggins, and Mrs. Walsberger, and Mrs. Wogus. Here, Jock, you take 3 straws in your mouth. 1 long one and 2 short. Now, let 'em draw, and the one that gets the long straw goes." Jock got the straws, and the cows drew. Mrs. Wiggins won. "All fair and above board, you see," said Jinx. "Now, horses next. Step up, please. It's getting late." As soon as the cat had taken charge of things, the meeting became more orderly, and arrangements for the departure of all of those whom Mr. Bean would not need during the winter was quickly made. Then, when everything was decided, Charles got up again to make another speech. There wasn't really anything left for him to say, but he was fond of making speeches. He spoke so beautifully that everybody liked to hear him, although, when they got home, they could never remember anything he had said. "Now, my friends," he began, "before we break up this distinguished meeting, I should like to give you one thought to take home with you in your hearts, something to carry away with you as the memento of the kindness and good fellowship we have enjoyed here together tonight. As I look about me this evening upon all these bright, eager young faces, gathered together here under one roof, it is borne in upon me." But what it was that was borne in upon him, they never knew, for at that point he stopped suddenly and climbed hastily down from the buggy seat. His wife Henrietta had come in the door. She marched straight down toward him between the rows of silent animals and caught him by the wing. "Bright, eager young faces, is it?" she exclaimed angrily. "I'll give you a bright, eager young face," and she boxed his right ear with her claw. "I'll give you something to carry home with you," and she boxed the other ear. I never heard such nonsense. Charles hunched his head down between his shoulders. "But, my dear," he protested. "Don't you my dear me," she said. "You come along home, where you belong, staying out all night like this, reveling and carousing with a lot of silly pigs and cows that don't know any better. The very idea!" She pushed him unceremoniously towards the door. But before they reached it, another figure appeared, a short, bearded man in a long white nightshirt and carpet slippers. Mr. Bean had been awakened by the noise, and had come out to see what was the matter. He had a lantern in one hand and a carriage whip in the other, and on his head was the white cotton nightcap with the red tassel. "You animals go to bed," he said gruffly. Then he turned round and stumped back to the house. In 30 seconds all the animals had gone, and the cow barn was empty, except Mrs. Wiggins and Mrs. Wurzburger and Mrs. Wogus, who lived there. Chapter 3. The next morning, as soon as Mr. Bean had left the house, Jinx the cat, who had been pretending to be asleep under the stove, jumped up on the table and got a pencil and a piece of paper and carried them out and laid them down under the big elm tree beside the barn. Then he looked up among the branches, and pretty soon he saw a bright little eye peeping out at him from behind a limb. "Good morning, Robin," he said politely. "I wonder if you'd do me a little favor. We animals are going to migrate this fall, but as none of us have ever been south before, we don't know the way, and I thought perhaps you'd be willing to draw us a little map." The robin hopped a little way along the branch and cocked his head and looked down at Jinx with its right eye. "I don't know what made you think that," he said. "I don't know why I should do anything for you. You're always chasing me, and there's never a minute's peace for me or my family when you're in the barnyard. And you ate up all my wife's third cousin last June, but I suppose you've forgotten all about that." "I certainly haven't," said Jinx. "It was a most regrettable incident. I was really terribly upset about it. I had no idea that robin was any relative of your wife's. When I saw him prowling around your nest, I thought he wanted to steal your children, of course. I didn't stop to make inquiries then. Afterwards, when I found out what a mistake I had made, I would have done anything to restore him to you. But of course, it was too late." "Rather late," said the robin dryly, "since there was nothing left of him but a few tail feathers." "Well, let's not rake up old scores," said Jinx. "What's done is done, as the saying goes, and if you'll make this map for me, I'll promise never to chase you or any of your family again." "Well, that's fair enough," said the robin, and he flew down, picking up the pencil in his claw, began to draw the map that would show them exactly how to go to Florida. Meanwhile, all the other animals who were going were packing up and making their farewell calls on those who were to stay at home, for they had heard Mr. Bean say that he was going to drive into town the next morning, and they thought that would be the best time for them to start on their journey, because he wouldn't get back until late in the afternoon, and by that time they would be many miles away. Nearly everybody in the barnyard was happy but Charles the rooster. He sat alone in the darkest corner of the henhouse, his tail feathers drooping miserably, for his wife Henrietta had positively refused to let him go. "Go south for the winter, would you?" she had said. "Never in my life have I heard such a pack of nonsensical notions. What right have you to go traipsing off over the country, you with a wife and children to look after? Not that you ever do look after them. Who's going to get Mr. Bean up in the morning, I should like to know?" "He can wake himself up," said Charles. "He doesn't have to get up so early in the winter time anyway." "Well, you're not going, that's flat," said his wife, and that settled it. When Henrietta put her foot down, there was nothing more to be said. Some of the animals, too, had held the opinion that the cat ought not to go either, since it was his duty to keep the mice out of the barn, where the grain and vegetables were stored. But that was easily arranged, for some of the mice wanted to go, and so Jinx promised that he would let them alone if the mice that stayed home would keep away from the barn while he was gone. This pleased the other animals, for although Jinx was a wild fellow, rather careless in appearance and a bit too free in his speech, they all felt that he would be a good animal to have with them in a pinch, and no one knew what dangers might lie in wait for them on the road to Florida. Indeed, a number of the more timid animals, who had been carried away by enthusiasm at the meeting in the cow barn, had not felt so anxious to go when they had thought it all over. All the sheep had backed out, and most of the mice, and all the pigs except Freddy. The pigs were not afraid. They were just awfully lazy, and the thought of walking perhaps 20 miles a day for goodness knows how many days was too much for them. At last the great day came. Mr. Bean harnessed up William to the buggy early in the morning and drove off to town, and then all the animals gathered in the barnyard. From the window of the henhouse, Charles watched them unhappily. They were all so merry and excited, and the pigs had come up to see Freddy off, and were all talking at once and giving him a great deal more advice than he could possibly remember, and Hank the old white horse was continually running back into the barn for another mouthful of oats, because he didn't know when he should get any good oats again. And Alice and Emma, the two white ducks, had waddled off down to the end of the pasture to take one last look at the old familiar duck pond, which they wouldn't see again until next spring. It made Charles very sad. "Why don't you go out and say good-bye to them, Charles?" said Henrietta. It made her feel bad to see him so unhappy, for she really had a kind heart, and way down inside of it she was very fond of him. But he was so careless and forgetful that she often had to be quite cross to him. "No," said Charles mournfully. "No, I shall stay here. They've forgotten all about me. They don't care because I can't go with them. And they don't remember who it was that gave them the idea in the first place. No, let them go. Heartless creatures. What do I care?" "Nonsense," said Henrietta. "Go along out." And so Charles ruffled up his feathers and held his head up in the air and marched out into the yard. All the good-byes had been said, and the travelers were ready to start. The barnyard was silent as they formed in a line and marched out through the gate into the road that stretched away like a long white ribbon to far distant Florida. First came Jinks with his tail held straight up in the air like a drum major's stick. Then came Freddy the Pig and the dog Robert, who was Jock's younger brother. After them marched Hank and Mrs. Wiggins, and the procession was brought up by the two white ducks, Alice and Emma, who were sisters. The mice, Eek, Quick, and Eenie, and Cousin Augustus, ran along the side of the road so as not to be stepped on. The stay-at-home crowded out to the gate, waving paws and hoofs and calling, "Goodbye, goodbye! Don't forget to ride. Have a good time and remember us to Florida." Overhead, a flock of swallows darted and turned a swift wing. "Goodbye," they twittered. "We'll see you in a week or two. We start south in about 10 days ourselves." Charles stood on the gate-post and watched the little procession march off down the road. Smaller and smaller it grew. Then it went over a hill, and the white road was empty again. But long after it had gone, Charles sat on, and his tail feathers drooped, and his head drooped down on his chest, and a great tear splashed on the gate-post. But luckily no one saw him cry, for the animals had all gone back to their daily tasks. At least that's what he thought, but Henrietta saw him from the window of the hen-house.